Morning on the Ukraine front often begins before the sun rises. The sky slowly changes color, from deep gray to pale blue, revealing a landscape shaped by trenches, damaged buildings, and open fields that have seen far too many days of fighting. On one such morning, along a battered stretch of land somewhere on the Ukraine front, the air carried the smell of smoke even before daylight arrived. It came from a position where Ukrainian soldiers had been holding a defensive line through the night. The position itself was simple: a series of shallow trenches dug along the edge of a ruined industrial yard. Sandbags reinforced the corners, broken concrete slabs provided additional cover along the outer edges. The soldiers stationed there had spent hours watching the horizon. Night shifts in places like this are quiet but tense. Radios whisper small updates. Boots move carefully through mud and gravel. Every distant sound is measured. Somewhere in the darkness before dawn, the quiet had changed. Explosions had broken the silence, not constant at first, just several sharp impacts landing beyond the Ukrainian position. Dirt lifted into the air, smoke rolled across the ground where the shells struck. The soldiers inside the trenches moved quickly. Helmets pulled tight, rifles lifted, radios crackled as units confirmed the source of the fire. Russian artillery had begun landing near the defensive line. The explosions were not random. They walked across the ground in measured intervals, creeping closer to the Ukrainian position. Inside one trench, several Ukrainian soldiers crouched behind sandbags as another explosion struck the far side of the yard. The blast threw dust into the air. Fragments struck the metal shell of a nearby vehicle that had been abandoned weeks earlier. When the dust settled, one soldier was down. He had been positioned near the edge of the trench when the explosion landed. The others around him called for help immediately. Across the defensive line, one person carried the responsibility for moments exactly like this: the combat medic. In Ukrainian units, combat medics often move with the soldiers they support. They carry medical kits instead of heavy weapons, but they operate under the same conditions as everyone else around them. On that morning, the Ukrainian medic had been stationed several positions away along the trench line. When the call came across the radio, the message was brief: one soldier wounded, location confirmed, smoke still rising across the yard. The medic gathered the equipment quickly: a field medical bag, bandages, emergency supplies needed to stabilize a wounded soldier under battlefield conditions. The radio repeated the warning: artillery activity was still active. Smoke and debris continued drifting across the open ground between the trenches. The wounded soldier lay beyond a stretch of exposed earth where fragments from the explosion had scattered across the yard. The safest choice would have been to wait. Wait for the smoke to clear. Wait for confirmation that the shelling had stopped. But the medic understood something else. Time mattered. Every minute after an injury carries consequences on a battlefield. The Ukrainian medic climbed out of the trench. The air still carried dust from the recent explosion. Several soldiers nearby watched as the medic began moving toward the open ground. One of them spoke quietly over the radio again. Artillery risks still present. Movement across the yard dangerous. The medic did not stop. Step by step, the figure moved through drifting smoke toward the wounded soldier. Fragments of broken concrete and metal lay scattered across the ground. The medic stepped carefully over them, keeping low as the smoke rolled across the yard. Another distant explosion sounded somewhere beyond the Ukrainian line. Not close, but enough to remind everyone that the artillery had not completely ended. The medic reached the wounded soldier and dropped to one knee beside him. Dust settled slowly around them. The soldier in the trench nearby watched the moment through the thin clearing of smoke. The medic worked quickly. Medical training on a battlefield is not complicated by unnecessary motion. Hands move with precision. Supplies come from the bag exactly when needed. The wounded soldier was conscious. His breathing was unsteady, but he remained responsive. The medic spoke quietly while working. Short sentences meant to keep the soldier focused. Then the medic tightened a bandage and checked the soldier's breathing again. The smoke across the yard continued drifting slowly. The Ukrainian trenches remained alert. Rifles still pointed toward the horizon where the artillery had originated. For a moment, the medic paused beside the wounded soldier and looked back toward the trench. The distance was not far, but the ground between them remained exposed. The medic spoke softly, almost like a promise carried through the haze. "I'm here." 2 simple words, no speeches, just a quiet statement that someone had reached him. The wounded soldier nodded weakly. The medic adjusted the bandage once more and prepared to move him back toward the trench where safer treatment could continue. Behind them, the Ukrainian soldiers remained ready along the defensive line, watching the smoke, watching the horizon, and waiting for the moment when the medic and the wounded soldier would cross that open ground and return to safety. The sun had not yet risen fully above the Ukraine front, but in that drifting smoke, a Ukrainian combat medic had already made a decision that morning: run toward the danger, not away from it. The smoke still drifted across the yard. It moved slowly now, pushed by a light wind that carried the smell of burned soil and metal through the broken concrete structures surrounding the Ukrainian defensive line. Inside the trenches, the soldiers kept their eyes on the horizon. The artillery had not resumed immediately, but no one assumed it was finished. Moments of silence on a battlefield are often temporary. In the center of the yard, the Ukrainian combat medic remained beside the wounded soldier. The medic had already applied the first bandage and checked his breathing. A field dressing wrapped tightly around the injured area. The soldier was conscious but weak. Dust from the earlier blast still clung to his uniform. The medic spoke quietly again, leaning close enough so the soldier could hear over the wind. "Stay with me." The words were simple. They carried no drama, no urgency in tone, just calm instruction meant to keep the wounded man focused while the medic prepared the next step. The Ukrainian trenches waited only a short distance away, but the ground between them remained open. Fragments of broken stone and scattered debris covered the yard where the shell had landed. Pieces of twisted metal from old equipment lay half buried in dirt that had been thrown into the air by the blast. The medic adjusted the straps of the medical bag and looked toward the trench. Several soldiers watched from behind the sandbags. Their rifles remained ready, scanning the horizon where Russian artillery had fired earlier. The medic lifted the wounded soldier carefully, not quickly. Battlefield evacuation requires controlled movement. The injured man leaned against the medic's shoulder, his weight supported carefully as they began moving across the yard. Each step was deliberate. The medic moved slowly to avoid slipping on loose debris scattered across the ground. Behind them, the smoke from the explosion continued thinning as the wind carried it away. One of the soldiers in the trench watched the movement closely through binoculars. He followed the medic's path across the open yard, measuring the distance back to the trench. Another soldier kept his eyes fixed on the distant tree line beyond the industrial yard. The artillery position had fired from somewhere beyond that horizon. Everyone in the trench understood the same risk. If the shelling returned while the medic and the wounded soldier were still crossing the open ground, there would be no cover, but the medic continued moving, step by step. The injured soldier struggled to stay upright, but the medic kept a steady grip on his arm and shoulder, guiding him forward. The ground beneath their boots was uneven. Dust rose slightly with each step, mixing with the remaining smoke drifting across the yard. Inside the trench, one soldier spoke quietly over the radio. He reported the medic's position: distance to trench, movement continuing. The radio responded with a brief acknowledgement. Nearby Ukrainian units were still monitoring the artillery position. No new impacts had been detected for several minutes. That information did not guarantee safety, but it gave the medic time. Halfway across the yard, the wounded soldier stumbled. The medic caught him before he fell. For a moment, they both paused. The medic steadied the soldier and adjusted the bandage again where the field dressing had begun to loosen. Then the medic spoke softly, the voice calm despite the tension surrounding them. "Almost there." The trench line was closer now. From behind the sandbags, several soldiers leaned forward slightly, ready to reach out when the two figures came within arm's reach. The medic resumed moving. The injured soldier leaned heavily against him. Their pace was slow but steady. Boots stepped over scattered debris left by the explosion. The medic avoided several pieces of twisted metal lying across the path. The wind pushed the remaining smoke away from the yard, revealing more of the open ground. For the first time since the explosion, the entire trench line could clearly see the two figures approaching. The soldiers in the trench remained quiet. No shouting, no sudden movements. They watched carefully, rifles still pointed outward toward the distant horizon. Then the medic and the wounded soldier reached the edge of the trench. Two Ukrainian soldiers leaned forward immediately, grabbing the injured man under the arms and guiding him down into the trench. The medic climbed in after him. The moment both men crossed the sandbag barrier, the soldiers moved quickly to secure the trench again. Rifles returned to their firing positions. The radio operator repeated a short update confirming that the wounded soldier had been brought inside. Inside the trench, the medic continued working. The field dressing was replaced with additional bandaging from the medical bag. The medic checked the soldier's breathing again and secured the bandage more tightly. The wounded soldier lay back against the trench wall. His breathing was still heavy, but stable. Dust from the yard clung to his jacket and gloves. The medic wiped some of the dirt away from the soldier's face and checked his pulse once more. The soldiers nearby returned to their watch positions along the trench. The horizon remained quiet. Smoke from the earlier explosion had almost completely disappeared now. For a moment, the medic sat back on the trench floor, catching a brief breath after the crossing. Then the medic spoke quietly to the wounded soldier again. "You made it back." The soldier nodded faintly. Around them, the Ukrainian defensive line returned to its steady rhythm. Observation points scanned the horizon. Radios continued passing quiet updates between positions. The medic secured the last bandage and closed the medical bag. The wounded soldier would soon be moved further back for additional treatment, but the first and most dangerous step had already been completed. Across that open yard filled with drifting smoke, a Ukrainian combat medic had reached a wounded soldier and brought him back alive. And along that stretch of the Ukraine front, the trenches remained held by the soldiers who had watched the entire moment unfold. The sun finally began to rise above the horizon. What had been a gray battlefield only minutes earlier slowly filled with pale morning light. Long shadows stretched across the ruined industrial yard where the explosion had torn into the ground. Inside the Ukrainian trench, the air felt calmer. The drifting smoke that had once covered the open ground had almost completely vanished. The wind had carried it away across the broken fences and empty fields beyond the defensive line, but the marks of the blast remained. Dark soil scattered across the yard, fragments of metal lying where the explosion had thrown them, and a wide crater cut into the ground where the artillery round had struck. The Ukrainian soldiers along the trench continued their watch. Their positions had not changed. Rifles rested along the sandbags. Observation posts scanned the distant horizon where Russian artillery had fired earlier that morning. War does not pause simply because one moment of danger has passed, but for a short time, the front had grown quiet again. Inside the trench, the combat medic remained beside the wounded soldier. The medical bag lay open near the medic's knees. Bandages had been replaced with stronger dressings meant to hold until the soldier could be moved further back from the front line. The wounded man rested against the wooden wall of the trench. His breathing had steadied. The medic checked the bandage one more time, tightening it slightly before closing the medical kit. Nearby, soldiers spoke quietly over the radio. Short updates passed between Ukrainian positions scattered across the area. Artillery activity had not resumed. Observation posts continued monitoring the distant tree line beyond the yard. The medic wiped dirt from their gloves and leaned back against the sandbags for a moment. It had been only a short crossing across the open ground, but moments like that stretch time. Every step across exposed terrain carries its own weight. The medic looked toward the yard where the wounded soldier had been lying only minutes earlier. The open ground seemed almost peaceful now. Birds had returned to the fence line beyond the broken tractor sitting near the edge of the field. Wind moved slowly across the tall grass surrounding the industrial yard, but the trench remained alert. One Ukrainian soldier near the observation point lowered his binoculars and looked toward the medic. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "You brought him back?" The medic nodded slightly. There was no dramatic answer, just a brief movement acknowledging what had happened. The wounded soldier shifted slightly against the trench wall. He looked toward the medic and managed a small nod. His voice was weak but steady enough to speak. "Thank you." The medic responded with a quiet sentence that carried no ceremony. "That's the job." Around them, the Ukrainian defensive line continued its routine. Two soldiers repositioned sandbags near the edge of the trench where fragments from the explosion had knocked several loose. Another soldier checked the mounted machine gun at the center of the defensive line, confirming that the weapon remained aligned with the approach road. The radio operator received another message from a nearby Ukrainian position. Medical evacuation would arrive soon. A vehicle stationed further back from the front would move forward to transport the wounded soldier away from the trench line. The medic listened carefully to the message and repeated the location of the trench. Then the radio fell quiet again. The soldiers returned to watching the horizon. Morning sunlight now touched the top of the buildings beyond the industrial yard. The broken walls and damaged rooftops glowed faintly under the rising sun. War leaves landscapes frozen between destruction and routine. A battlefield can look quiet even while danger waits just beyond sight. The medic stood slowly and checked the bandage one last time. The wounded soldier remained stable. His breathing had improved. The soldiers nearby prepared a stretcher that had been stored along the trench wall. It was simple equipment, light metal poles and strong fabric designed to carry an injured person safely across uneven ground. Two soldiers unfolded the stretcher and positioned it beside the wounded man. The medic helped lift him carefully onto the fabric. The movement was slow and controlled to avoid disturbing the bandage. Once he was secured, the soldiers prepared to carry him toward the access point where the evacuation vehicle would arrive. Before they lifted the stretcher, the medic spoke quietly again, the voice calm, steady. "You're going home from here." The wounded soldier closed his eyes for a moment. The soldiers lifted the stretcher and began moving along the trench line toward the rear position. The medic walked beside them for several steps, ensuring the bandage remained secure. Then the medic stopped near the center of the trench. Other soldiers would carry the wounded man the rest of the way. The stretcher moved slowly along the trench corridor until it disappeared around the bend where the defensive line connected to a safer rear path. The medic remained behind. There were still soldiers along the trench, and the position still required a combat medic. The medic picked up the medical bag and returned to the observation point. From there, the entire yard could be seen, the crater from the explosion, the debris scattered across the ground, the quiet road leading toward the distant horizon. For a moment, the medic stood in silence. Then a short sentence passed softly through the morning air. "No one stays alone out here." The wind moved through the grass once more. The rising sun continued to brighten the Ukraine front, and along that stretch of defensive line, Ukrainian soldiers remained in their positions while the medic who had run into the smoke prepared for whatever the next call might bring.